The Hall of 10,000 Stars was the oldest place in the known galaxy, and it floated in the cold silence of space like a crown made of metal and light, hanging in orbit around a dead white dwarf star that had burned out long before most species had learned to stand upright on their home worlds. Captain Rhea Marin stood at the viewport of her ship, the UES Defiance, and looked at the station through the thick glass, her reflection staring back at her with tired eyes and a long scar that ran from her left temple all the way down to her jaw. She had fought in 3 wars back on Earth, buried too many good soldiers under too many foreign skies, and survived things that still woke her up in the middle of the night with her heart hammering in her chest. But nothing in her entire life had ever made her feel as small as this ancient alien station did. "Captain," said Lieutenant Hara from behind her, "the Council is ready for us." Marin turned away from the viewport and straightened her uniform. It was dark blue with silver trim, the formal dress of the United Earth Navy, and she had ironed it 3 times that morning because she wanted every alien eye in that chamber to see that humanity took this seriously. Ambassador Idris Okafor was waiting for her near the airlock. He was a tall man with white hair and kind eyes that hid a mind as sharp as any blade, and he had spent the last 30 years of his life trying to get humanity a seat on the Galactic Council. 30 years of polite refusals, condescending smiles from beings who saw humans as little more than clever animals from a dangerous rock. "Are you ready for this?" Marin asked him. "I have been ready for 3 decades, Okafor said, with a small and tired smile. "The question is whether they are ready for us." They walked through the airlock together and into the Hall of 10,000 Stars, and the sheer size of the place hit Marin like a wall. The ceiling was so far above them that it disappeared into a kind of glowing mist, and the chamber itself was shaped like a massive bowl, with thousands of seats rising up on every side, each one designed for a different kind of alien body. Some seats were filled with water for aquatic species, and some were just platforms for creatures too large to sit, and some were tiny pods for beings no bigger than a human thumb. Every shape and color and size of intelligent life in the galaxy was represented here, and they all turned to look as the 2 humans walked in. At the center of the chamber, raised above everything else on a platform of white crystal, sat Archon Velathan. He was the leader of the council, a being made of living crystal that shifted between blue and silver as light passed through his body, and he was old beyond any measurement that humans could understand. Beside him stood Counselor Drethka of the Toravan Empire, a massive reptilian creature covered in dark green scales, with 4 arms and a jaw full of teeth that could bite through steel. And he looked down at the humans the way a predator looks at something too small to bother eating. And off to the side, almost hidden in the shadows, was Liaison Yuelin of the Pelori, a delicate being that looked something like a moth crossed with a dancer, with 4 paper-thin wings that shimmered in soft colors, and large dark eyes that seemed full of sadness. "Humanity," Velathan said, and his voice rang through the chamber like a bell struck in a cathedral. "You stand before this council once again to request full membership among the civilized species of this galaxy." "We do," said Ambassador Okafor, his voice steady and calm, even though Marin could see his hands shaking slightly behind his back. "You have been denied this request 14 times, Velathan continued, each time for the same reason. "Your species originates from a Class 7 Deathworld, a planet of extreme gravity, toxic atmosphere, radiation exposure, apex predators, and natural disasters that would kill most beings in this chamber within hours." A murmur ran through the gallery, thousands of alien voices whispering in hundreds of languages. "We are aware of our classification," Okafor said, "and we believe it is precisely our origin that makes us valuable to this council, not a reason to exclude us." Drethka let out a sound that was something between a laugh and a growl. "Valuable," he repeated in his deep rumbling voice. The creature from the poison world thinks it is valuable. Tell me, human, what value does a species bring when it cannot even stop killing members of its own kind? Marin felt her jaw tighten, but she said nothing. That was Okafor's arena, not hers. Every species in this chamber has a history of internal conflict, Okafor replied without missing a beat. We have studied the records. The Torvan unification wars lasted 600 years and cost billions of lives, Counselor. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut glass, and Drethka's 4 hands curled into fists. Velithod raised one crystalline arm, and the chamber went quiet. Enough, he said. The Council has discussed this matter at length, and we have reached a decision. Marin held her breath. Humanity will be given one final opportunity to prove its worth, Velithon announced. You will undergo the trial of the Crucible. The reaction in the chamber was immediate and loud. Hundreds of alien delegates rose from their seats, some shouting in protest, and others humming or clicking in shock. Because everyone in that room knew what the Crucible was. It was an ancient trial, built thousands of years ago by the founding species of the Council. A massive station designed to test whether a species was truly fit to join galactic civilization. But it had not been used in over 800 cycles, because the last species that had attempted it lost all 40 of their candidates, and nobody ever spoke about what happened inside. The terms are simple, Velithon said over the noise. You will send one team of 12 individuals into the Crucible. They will receive no weapons, no outside communication, and no rescue. They will face the trials within, and they will either emerge or they will not. If they emerge, humanity will receive its seat. Drethka smiled, showing every one of his terrible teeth. Send your best warriors, little humans, he said. It will not matter. Okafor looked at Marin, and she gave him a single nod. They had prepared for something like this, hoped it would never come to it, but prepared all the same. We accept, Okafor said. Over the next 3 days, Captain Marin selected her team, and the choices she made confused every alien observer who watched the process. She did not pick 12 of humanity's strongest soldiers, or its most decorated fighters. She chose Sergeant Kai Tanaka, a combat specialist, yes, but she also chose Dr. Lena Vasquez, a field medic who had worked in disaster zones across 4 continents. She chose Chief Engineer Amos Bankol, who could build a radio out of scrap metal and spit. She chose Dr. Priya Sharma, a linguist who spoke 11 Earth languages and had already learned 3 alien ones. She chose Maya Chen, a botanist who studied how plants survived in the worst places on Earth. She chose Dr. James Osei, a psychologist who had helped soldiers come back from the darkest places in their own minds. And she chose Henri Dubois, a chef who believed that a good meal could save a life just as surely as a good doctor. The rest were soldiers and specialists, but the mix baffled the Council observers. They bring a cook? Drethka said to Velithon with disbelief dripping from every word. They bring a plant scientist and a mind healer to a death trial. Yuelin watched from her place in the shadows and said nothing, but her wings shifted to a color that in Pelori body language meant something close to, you do not understand what you are looking at. On the final night before the trial, as the team prepared to board the Crucible station, Yuelin approached Ambassador Okafor in a quiet corridor. Her voice was soft, and it trembled slightly as she spoke. Ambassador, she said, I must tell you something that the Council will not. The last species to attempt the Crucible sent 40 of their finest warriors into that station, and not one of them came out alive. The Council does not expect your people to survive this. Many of them are counting on it. Okafor looked at her for a long moment, and then said, Thank you for your honesty, liaison. Why are you not afraid? She asked. Oh, I am terrified, Okafor said, but I have learned something in 30 years of dealing with this Council. Fear is not a reason to stop, it is a reason to be careful. The next morning, The 12 humans stood before the massive airlock of the Crucible Station. It was an enormous structure, old and dark and covered in symbols that no living species could fully translate. And it hummed with a deep vibration that Marin could feel in her bones. 12 people from different countries, different backgrounds, different skills, standing together in the cold light of an alien station 1,000 light years from home. "Whatever is in there," she said, "we face it together. We watch out for each other. We do not leave anyone behind. That is the only order I am giving you." They nodded, every one of them, and she could see the fear in their eyes, but she could also see something else, something stubborn and bright and very, very human. They stepped through the airlock, and the massive door sealed shut behind them with a sound like a tomb closing. The lights went dark, and then a voice spoke, deep and ancient and coming from everywhere at once, a voice that had not spoken in 800 years. "Crucible initiated. Survival is not guaranteed. Adaptation is mandatory." In the observation chamber, 1,000 light years of sensor feeds flickered to life, and the entire Galactic Council leaned forward to watch 12 humans walk into the dark. The first thing the 12 humans felt was heat, a wave of it that hit them like a physical blow the moment the crucible shifted around them, the walls and floor dissolving and reforming into something new and terrible. One moment they were standing in a dark metal corridor, and the next they were standing on a field of black volcanic rock beneath a sky that glowed a sickly orange-red. The ground was cracked and jagged, with rivers of molten lava visible through the gaps, and the air was so hot that it burned the inside of their noses with every breath. "Temperature reading," Captain Marin said, her voice calm, even though sweat was already forming on her forehead. Engineer Bankole held up a small device he had built from spare components in his suit. 71 degrees at ground level, he said. "Sulfur content in the air is high, but not immediately lethal. We have maybe 16 hours before the gas exposure starts causing real damage to our lungs. So we have 16 hours to get through this," Sergeant Tanaka said, already scanning the landscape for threats. In the observation chamber far above them, the Galactic Council watched through sensor feeds as the humans began to move. And the first thing that confused them was the sweat. "What is happening to their skin?" asked a delegate from the Marathi Collective, a species of tall, thin beings who regulated their body temperature through color changes in their scales. "They are leaking fluid," said another observer with clear disgust in their voice. Liaison Yulin leaned forward in her seat and watched closely. She had studied human biology in preparation for this day, and she knew what the others did not. Humans were one of the only species in the galaxy that cooled their bodies by pushing water through their skin, a process so simple and so effective that it allowed them to function in temperatures that would shut down the organs of almost every other known species within minutes. The Crucible's first trial was called the Furnace, and it was designed to test raw physical endurance. The previous record for survival in this environment was 3 hours, set by a species of rock-dwelling creatures with thick natural armor. The humans did not have thick armor. They had soft skin and relatively fragile bodies. But they had something else. "Strip down to base layers," Marin ordered. "Conserve water. Small sips only. Bankole, can you modify your gas detector to find us a path around the worst of the sulfur vents?" "Already working on it, Captain." Maya Chen, the botanist, knelt beside a crack in the volcanic rock and examined something growing there. It was a thick, spongy, fungus-like organism that seemed to thrive in the heat, and when she carefully cut one open with a piece of sharp stone, clear liquid dripped out. "This stores water," she said with excitement in her voice. "It is like a desert cactus, but adapted for volcanic environments. We can squeeze these for hydration." Dr. Vasquez tested the liquid on a small patch of skin first, then tasted a tiny drop. "It is clean," she confirmed, "slightly mineral but safe." The council observers watched this exchange with growing confusion. The humans were not panicking, not trying to find an exit. not fighting each other for resources. They were working together with a kind of practiced efficiency that looked almost casual, as if walking through a volcanic hellscape was just another Tuesday. Drethka watched from his seat, with his forearms crossed. "Beginner's luck," he muttered. "The heat will take them soon enough." But the hours passed, and the heat did not take them. Marin kept the team moving in a steady rotation. Walk for 40 minutes, rest for 20. Hydrate from the fungal water stores that Chen kept finding along their path. The psychologist Dr. Ose kept watch on everyone's mental state, checking in with quiet conversations, keeping spirits up with small jokes and calm reassurance. When one team member, a young specialist named Torres, started showing signs of heat exhaustion, Dr. Vasquez had her lying in the shade of an overhang within seconds, cooling her core temperature with damp strips of fabric torn from spare clothing. They walked for 14 hours through that burning landscape, and when the environment finally shimmered and dissolved around them, all 12 of them were still standing, exhausted, dehydrated, covered in ash and burns, but alive. The previous record had been 3 hours. The humans had lasted nearly 5 times longer. In the observation chamber, nobody spoke for a very long time. Then, the second trial began. The volcanic wasteland was replaced in an instant by dense, dark jungle. Massive trees with bark as black as coal rose up around them, and the canopy above was so thick that almost no light came through. Instead, the jungle was lit by bioluminescent plants and fungi that glowed in eerie blues and greens, and somewhere in the darkness, something was moving. "Contact," Tanaka whispered, dropping to one knee. "Multiple signatures, fast movers, circling us." The predators came out of the dark like nightmares given form. They were sleek, six-legged creatures with eyeless heads full of needle-thin teeth, and they hunted in packs of 8 or more, using sound and vibration to track their prey. Their claws dripped with a paralytic venom that the Crucible's designers had specifically engineered to shut down motor functions in most galactic species. The first attack came fast and hard, 3 of them lunging from the undergrowth at the same time. But humans are persistent predators from a world full of things that want to kill them. And Sergeant Tanaka had been fighting since he was 19 years old. He grabbed a fallen branch as thick as his arm and swung it like a club, catching the first creature across the skull with a crack that echoed through the jungle. "Form up," Marin shouted. "Circle formation, backs to each other, nobody stands alone." They had no weapons, so they made them. Sharpened sticks carved with rocks, vine tripwires strung between trees, deadfall traps built from heavy logs. Within 2 hours, the humans had turned a small clearing into a fortified camp that would have made any Earth military instructor proud. Dr. Osei watched the predators from behind the perimeter and began taking notes in his head. "They always approach from downwind," he said, "and they hesitate when we make direct loud sounds. I think their echolocation is sensitive to certain frequencies." "So if we shout at them, it hurts?" Tanaka asked. "Essentially, yes," Dr. Osei replied. The next time the predators charged, the humans screamed at them. 12 human voices howling into the dark jungle, and the creatures flinched and stumbled, their coordination breaking apart just long enough for the traps to do their work. When one human was clawed across the shoulder, Dr. Vasquez had the wound cleaned and bandaged in minutes, while the rest of the team held the line. They fought in shifts, rotating who slept and who kept watch, and every single one of them took their turn at the front. And then Henri Dubois, the chef, did something that made the entire Galactic Council lose their collective minds. He butchered one of the dead predators, built a small fire using friction and dry bark, and cooked it. The smell of roasting alien meat filled the jungle clearing, and the surviving predators, who had been circling for hours, suddenly pulled back, not because of the fire, but because they could smell one of their own being consumed by the creatures they had been hunting. "They are eating the hunters," Yulene whispered, her wings pressed flat against her body, in shock. "That is barbaric," said the Marathi delegate. Drethka said nothing, but his scales had gone pale, which in Torvan physiology was an involuntary fear response. The humans ate the predator meat, rested in shifts, and when the jungle dissolved around them 12 hours later, they walked out with weapons they had made and food they had caught, looking less like victims and more like the most dangerous things in that jungle. The third trial was a labyrinth, a vast shifting maze of corridors and locked doors, each one requiring a different kind of puzzle to open. Mathematical equations, pattern recognition, spatial reasoning, and encrypted text in a language so old that even the council's best scholars could only partially read it. Dr. Priya Sharma, the linguist, took one look at the inscriptions on the walls and sat down cross-legged on the floor. "This is a precursor language," she said. "It is related to 3 other dead languages I have studied. Give me time, and I can work out the grammar." Meanwhile, Engineer Bankole was pressing his ear against the walls, listening to the machinery. "The maze shifts on a pattern," he announced. "Every 40 minutes the corridors rotate. If I can figure out the sequence, I can predict where the exits will be before they move." They split into working groups. Sharma decoded the language, Bankole mapped the mechanical pattern, and the others worked on the mathematical puzzles at each door. They argued loudly about solutions, voices rising and hands waving, and in the observation chamber, several council members thought the team was falling apart. "They are fighting," Drethka said with satisfaction. "The stress has broken them." But Yuelin shook her head. "No," she said quietly, "watch what happens next." After the argument, the humans suddenly moved together with even greater speed and purpose. The disagreement had not broken them, it had sharpened them. They had tested every idea against every other idea and found the best one, and now they all moved in the same direction with total confidence. Dr. Ose had also noticed something the others had missed. The maze was playing tricks on their minds, whispering sounds that were not real, showing corridors that led nowhere, creating the sensation of being followed. It was testing their psychological endurance alongside their intelligence. "The maze is lying to you," he told the team calmly. "If you hear something that makes you feel afraid or hopeless, it is the trial, not reality. Trust your team, not your ears." They solved the labyrinth in 6 hours. The design time was 40 hours, and no species in history had done it in under 20. The observation chamber had gone very quiet. The fourth trial was the worst of all, and it came with no warning. One moment the 12 humans were standing together, and the next they were each alone, in complete darkness. Sensory deprivation. No light, no sound, no touch, no sense of time passing. Just absolute nothing, designed to break even the strongest mind through pure isolation. The galactic average was 7 hours before hallucinations began, and 12 hours before permanent psychological damage occurred. The humans were kept in isolation for 72 hours. In the observation chamber, the council watched the sensor readings. 12 humans, each in a separate sealed pod, sitting in total darkness. And what happened next was something that none of them could explain. The humans talked to themselves, not the desperate babbling of a breaking mind, but real conversation, as if they had a companion that nobody else could see. Captain Marin replayed chess games in her head, moving pieces on a board that existed only in her imagination. Henry the chef planned an elaborate 7-course meal, muttering about seasoning and timing as if he were in his kitchen back on Earth. Dr. Vasquez recited the names of every patient she had ever saved, and the youngest team member, Specialist Torres, began to panic. Her breathing went fast and shallow, and tears ran down her face in the dark, and for a moment it seemed like the trial had finally found something it could break. But then a sound came through the thin walls of the pods, a rhythmic tapping, steady and deliberate. It was Marin, knocking on the wall in patterns, in old Morse code, spelling out 2 words over and over: "Still here." One by one, The others joined in, tapping, humming, singing old songs that vibrated through the metal. They could not see each other, could not touch each other, but they refused to let any member of their team feel alone. Torres pressed her hands against the wall, felt the vibrations, and her breathing slowed. She closed her eyes in the dark and began to sing, softly at first and then louder, and the sound carried through the walls to 11 other pods where 11 other humans smiled in the darkness. After 72 hours, the pods opened, and 12 humans stumbled out into the light, shaking, exhausted, some of them crying, but every single one of them still whole. In the observation chamber, Archon Velethan stood perfectly still, his crystalline body flickering through colors that his aides had never seen before. He turned to his closest advisor and whispered, "What kind of world creates minds like this?" Several council members had left during the isolation trial, unable to watch any longer. Drethka remained in his seat, his face unreadable, his 4 hands gripping the armrests so hard that the metal bent. The 5th and final trial came quickly after the 4th, as if the crucible itself was eager to finish what it had started. The 12 humans stood in a simple room with a single door, a lever on the wall, and a countdown display showing numbers decreasing steadily. The ancient voice of the crucible spoke again, cold and mechanical. "Final trial. One must remain. The lever opens the door for 11. The one who pulls the lever is sealed inside the crucible permanently. Choose." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Captain Marin stepped forward. "I will stay," she said. "The rest of you go home." "No," said Sergeant Tanaka, stepping in front of her. "You have a daughter waiting for you on Earth." "I will stay." "You are not staying anywhere," said Dr. Vasquez, pushing past both of them. "I am the oldest here, and I have lived a full life." What followed was something the Galactic Council had never seen in the entire history of the Crucible. Every single member of the team volunteered to be the one left behind. Not one of them tried to save themselves at the expense of another. They argued with passion and love and stubbornness, each one making the case for why they should be the one to sacrifice everything. The Council had expected fear, infighting, cold logic, the weak being sacrificed by the strong. Instead, they watched 12 humans fight for the right to die for each other. But while the argument raged, Engineer Banco was not arguing at all. He was on his knees by the lever mechanism, his ear pressed against the wall, his fingers tracing the wiring behind a loose panel. "Everyone shut up for 1 second, he said suddenly, and the room went quiet. He pulled 2 wires free, crossed them, rerouted a power connection through his own suit battery, and pressed his palm against a circuit panel. There was a spark, a hum, and the door slid open without anyone touching the lever. Nobody had to stay behind. The Crucible's ancient voice spoke one more time, and for the first time in thousands of years, it deviated from its programmed script. "Solution unprecedented," it said, and there was something in its tone that almost sounded like surprise. "Recording for archive, bruised and burned, starving and exhausted, covered in ash and sweat and alien blood, standing in the light of an open door that was never supposed to open for all of them." And they smiled. They walked out together, all 12 of them, through the final gate of the Crucible station and into a corridor where a single observation window showed the stars beyond. And Captain Marin stopped and looked at her team and felt something rise in her chest that was bigger than pride, bigger than relief. It was the feeling of having been tested by the universe itself and having answered back. In the observation chamber, the sensor feeds went dark one by one as the Crucible powered down, and 1,000 alien delegates sat in absolute silence. Yulian's wings had turned a color that had no translation in any language except her own, and it meant something close to wonder, mixed with a kind of fierce joy. Drethka stared at the dark screens and did not move. And Archon Velethan, the ancient crystalline leader of the Galactic Council, looked down at his own hands and realized they were shaking. The emergency session began within the hour, and the hull of 10,000 stars was louder than it had been in living memory. Every seat was filled, and every delegate was talking, arguing, shouting, in their own language, and the translation system struggled to keep up with the sheer volume of noise. On the central platform, Archon Velethan stood motionless while the chaos swirled around him, his crystalline body dim and still, in a way that his aides recognized as deep distress. Beside him, Counselor Drethka paced back and forth on his heavy legs with his 4 arms clenched tight. And on the other side of the chamber, Liaison Uelian sat with her wings folded and her dark eyes watching everything. The humans had been escorted to a waiting area aboard the station, given food and water and medical attention. Captain Marin had wanted to stay and hear the council's decision, but Ambassador Okafor had told her to rest. "Let me handle the politics," he had said. "You have done the impossible part." Now Okafor stood alone on the speaker's platform, before 1,000 alien species, and he waited for silence with the kind of patience that comes from 30 years of being told no. "The results of the crucible are clear," Velethan finally said, bringing the chamber to order. "The human team completed all 5 trials. This is a matter of record." "It is also a matter of record," Drethka interrupted, his voice booming through the hall, "that no species has ever completed the crucible before. And I say that this fact should not comfort us. It should terrify us." A murmur of agreement rippled through parts of the chamber, and Okafor noted which species nodded along. The Torvan were not the only ones who were afraid. "These humans survived temperatures that would boil the blood of most species here," Drethka continued, pointing one massive clawed finger at the human ambassador. "They killed and consumed predators specifically designed to be lethal. They solved puzzles faster than any AI prediction model suggested was possible. They endured psychological torture that has destroyed the minds of beings far more advanced than them. And then, when asked to sacrifice one of their own, they broke the trial itself, rather than accept the terms." He paused and looked around the chamber. "This is not a species asking politely for a seat at our table. This is a species that could burn the table to the ground if it chose to, and we are considering inviting them to sit down." The chamber erupted again, voices overlapping in 100 languages. Okafor waited until the noise settled, and then spoke in a voice that was quiet, but carried clearly through the translation systems. "Counselor Drethka describes our survival as a threat, but I would ask this chamber to consider a different perspective. We were given a trial designed to destroy us, and we responded not with rage or vengeance, but with teamwork, ingenuity, and compassion. When the final trial demanded that we sacrifice a member of our team, not a single person among us was willing to let another die. Is that the behavior of a species you should fear, or the behavior of a species you should want standing beside you?" The debate raged for hours, and 3 clear factions emerged. The first was the welcoming bloc, led by Uelin and the Pelori delegation, along with several smaller species. They argued that humanity had proven itself beyond any reasonable standard, and that the Council's own rules demanded they be granted full membership. The second was the exclusion bloc, led by Drethka and the Torvan, supported by a handful of larger militaristic species. They argued that humanity was too dangerous, and that granting them access to galactic technology and travel networks would be like handing a loaded weapon to a child. The third faction was the undecided center, and it was the largest group of all, led quietly by Velethan himself. They were torn between admiration and terror, and they watched the debate with the uncomfortable expression of people who knew that no matter what they decided, the galaxy would never be the same. While the debate continued, Velethan did something he had not done in centuries. He left the chamber during an active session, walking alone through the ancient corridors of the station until he reached a part of the hall that almost nobody alive had ever visited. The Crucible Archives. The room was dark and cold, and filled with data crystals that stretched from floor to ceiling, each one containing records from the earliest days of the Council. Velathon moved through them with hands that trembled slightly, searching for something he had hoped he would never have to find. He found it in the oldest section of the archive, in crystals so ancient that they barely responded to his touch. The original design documents for the Crucible, written by the founding species of the Council over 12,000 years ago. And as he read them, his crystalline body went completely dark for the first time in his long life. The Crucible had never been a test of worthiness. It was a weapon. The founding species had built it specifically to eliminate Deathworld civilizations before they could grow powerful enough to challenge the established galactic order. The trials were not designed to be fair or passable. They were designed to be lethal, calibrated to exploit the weaknesses of high-gravity, high-threat species and kill them in ways that looked like a legitimate evaluation. Every species that had ever failed the Crucible had not simply been judged unworthy, they had been deliberately executed, their populations afterward quietly suppressed or reduced under the guise of protective quarantine. The Council, the great bastion of galactic civilization, had been built in part on a foundation of calculated genocide. And humanity, by being too stubborn and too clever and too cooperative to die, had accidentally exposed the whole lie. Velathon stood in the dark archive for a long time, feeling the weight of 12,000 years of deception pressing down on his ancient shoulders. Meanwhile, back in the main chamber, Ambassador Okafor was noticing something that made his stomach go cold. On his datapad, which was connected to the limited intelligence network humanity maintained in Council space, he could see ship movements. Torvon warships, dozens of them, repositioning from their border stations toward coordinates that Okafor recognized immediately. They were moving toward Earth's sector of the galaxy. He stepped away from the speaker's platform and found a quiet alcove, then pulled up the tactical display. 47 warships, all heavy cruisers and battleships, moving in a formation that any military officer would recognize as an attack pattern. Drethka was not just arguing against humanity's membership. He was preparing a backup plan. If the Council would not contain the humans, he would destroy them himself. Okafor's hands were steady as he composed a coded message. 30 years of diplomacy had taught him many things, and one of them was that you should always hope for the best and prepare for the worst. The message went out to Captain Marin on a frequency that the Council's systems were not monitoring, and it contained only 2 sentences. They are not deciding whether to let us in. They are deciding whether to let us live. In the waiting area of the station, Marin read the message, looked at her team, who were still recovering from the Crucible, and felt something cold and hard settle into the place behind her ribs, where fear usually lived. But it was not fear. It was something older and more dangerous. It was the quiet determination of a woman from a death world who had just been given one more reason to survive. She stood up and said 3 words to her team. "We have work to do." Captain Marin moved fast once she read Okafor's message. Within 30 minutes, she had her team back aboard the UES Defiance, and the ship's systems powered up and running hot. "Talk to me about those Torvan ships," she said to Lieutenant Hara, who was already at the tactical console, pulling up every scan and signal intercept they had. 47 warships in attack formation, Captain. They will reach Earth's sector in approximately 61 hours at their current speed. Their weapons are charged, and their shields are at combat readiness. This is not a patrol. This is a strike force. Marin nodded and opened a secure channel to Earth Command. The signal would take time to reach home, but she needed to make sure humanity was not caught sleeping. The message was short and direct. Possible hostile action incoming from Torvin Fleet. 47 capital ships on approach to Sol Sector. Recommend immediate defensive posture. Do not, repeat do not, fire first. We need to be defenders, not aggressors. She closed the channel and turned to her team. These 12 people who had walked through fire and darkness with her were exhausted. Some of them still bandaged and limping, but every single one of them was already at a station, ready to work. We are one ship, Tanaka said, checking the weapon systems, which were modest at best, against 47 Torvan warships. Captain, I respect your leadership, but I want to be clear about the math here. The math does not matter, Marin replied. What matters is the message. We are not going to fight 47 ships, Sergeant. We are going to stand in front of them. Back in the Hall of 10,000 Stars, the debate had become something close to a war of words. Drefka was making his final argument to the Council, and it was a powerful one, built on fear. I have studied the history of Deathworld species, he said, his voice rolling through the chamber like distant thunder. Every single one that has risen to spacefaring capability has eventually turned its aggression outward. The Cathari burned 3 systems before they were stopped. The Vorlon consumed the resources of an entire sector before the Council fleet put them down. Humans are stronger, smarter, and more adaptable than any of those species. And you want to give them a key to our door? Several delegations shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Drethka was not wrong about the history, and everyone in the chamber knew it. But then Liaison Yueline stood, and her soft voice carried a weight that surprised everyone, including herself. Counselor Drethka compares humans to the Cathari and the Vorlon, but he ignores a critical difference. The Cathari and the Vorlon never passed the Crucible. They never even attempted it. Humanity did not just survive the trials, they showed us something we have never seen before. A species that fights not to conquer, but to protect each other. A species that refuses to sacrifice its own, even when the rules demand it. That is not the behavior of a threat. It is the behavior of an ally. Drefka snorted. Pretty words from a species that has never had to defend itself against anything more dangerous than a strong wind. The insult landed hard, and Yuelin's wings flared bright red for a brief moment, but she composed herself and said nothing more. It was at this moment that Archon Velathon returned to the chamber, and everyone could see that something had changed in him. His crystalline body, usually bright and shifting with confident light, was dim and heavy, and he moved to the central platform with the slow steps of someone carrying a terrible burden. I must address this council on a matter of the gravest importance, he said, and the chamber fell silent because they had never heard him speak in that tone before. I have just come from the Crucible archives, where I reviewed the original design documents for the trial that we subjected humanity to, and what I found there has shaken me to the core of my being. He paused, and the silence was so complete that the faint hum of the station's systems seemed loud. The Crucible was never a test of fitness for council membership. It was a weapon of extermination, designed by our founding species to kill Deathworld civilizations before they could become a threat to the established order. Every species that has failed the Crucible was not merely judged and found wanting. They were murdered, and their populations were subsequently suppressed under the false authority of this council. The reaction was like an explosion. Delegates leaped from their seats, screaming in outrage and disbelief. Some species who had lost members to failed Crucible attempts centuries ago began to wail in grief and fury. The translation systems overloaded, and for several minutes the chamber was pure chaos. Through it all, Ambassador Okafor stood perfectly still, his face showing no surprise. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he had suspected something like this, because the trial had never felt like an evaluation. It had felt like an execution that they had somehow walked away from. Drefka was shouting that Velathan was lying, that this was a human trick, that the archives had been tampered with. But his voice was drowned out by the growing tide of anger from species who were now realizing that the council they had trusted for millennia had been built on a lie. It was in this chaos that Yualine made her move. She had been preparing for this moment ever since she watched 12 humans survive what was meant to kill them. And she used her diplomatic access codes to transmit the Crucible's original design documents to every galactic press network simultaneously. Within hours, the truth was spreading across the galaxy at the speed of light. And while the Council tore itself apart, Captain Marin flew the UES Defiance out of dock and pointed it directly at the path of Drethka's incoming fleet. One ship, alone in the dark between stars. "Open a broadband channel," she told Hara. "Every frequency, every band, every ship and station in this sector. I want everyone to hear this." The channel opened, and Marin stood on the bridge of her small ship, facing a wall of sensors that showed 47 enemy warships bearing down on her. And she spoke. "This is Captain Raya Marin of the United Earthship Defiance, speaking to the Torvon fleet and to every being in range of this signal. 72 hours ago, 12 humans entered the Crucible. I want to tell you who they are. Sergeant Kai Tanaka, who held the line against predators in the dark so that others could rest. Dr. Lena Vasquez, who healed wounds with steady hands while monsters circled. Chief Engineer Amos Bancole, who listened to the walls and found answers where there were supposed to be none. Dr. Priya Sharma, who read a dead language and brought it back to life. Maya Chen, who found water in a place of fire. Dr. James Osei, who kept 12 minds whole when the darkness tried to break them. Henry Dubois, who fed his team with his own hands and reminded them that they were human. And 5 more, Torres, Park, Okonkwo, Johansson, and Reeves, soldiers and scientists who gave everything they had and then gave more. We did not come to your stars to conquer. We came because we looked up at our night sky and wondered if we were alone. We are not asking for power. We are asking for a chair at the table. But if you bring a fleet to our door, know this. We walked through your hell and came out the other side, every one of us, and we will do it again." The signal went out across the sector, and on every ship and station, beings of every species heard it. On Drethka's flagship, the bridge crew exchanged uneasy glances. 3 of the allied species who had joined his coalition broke formation and peeled away from the fleet without a word. Then 5 more. Then 12, their captains sending brief messages that all said versions of the same thing. We did not sign up to attack a species that just proved the Council has been lying to us for 10,000 years. Drethka watched his coalition crumble and felt something he had not felt since he was a young warrior facing his first battle. It was fear, real and raw, not of the human weapons or the human ship, but of the human standing on its bridge, who had looked at 47 warships and had not flinched. He was left with only his own Torvon vessels, 12 ships facing one, and even those captains were hesitating. From the Hall of 10,000 Stars, Velathon's voice cut across all channels with the full authority of the Galactic Council behind it. "Stand down, Warlord Drethka. The Council will convene immediately." The Torvon fleet hung in space for a long, tense moment. 12 warships with their weapons locked on a single vessel that was not even trying to evade. Then one by one the weapons powered down, and the fleet turned away. On the bridge of the Defiance, Captain Marin let out a breath she had been holding for what felt like a lifetime, and her hands shook as she lowered them from the console, but she did not let anyone see. The Hall of 10,000 Stars had never been so full. Every seat was taken, and every gallery was packed, and beings had come from across the galaxy to witness what was happening. The corridors of the ancient station were crowded with delegates and observers and journalists, and the air hummed with the quiet tension of a moment that everyone knew would change everything. Captain Marin stood beside Ambassador Okafor at the speaker's platform. wearing the same dark blue uniform she had worn on the day of the crucible, now cleaned and pressed, but still bearing faint scorch marks that she had refused to have removed. Behind them stood the 11 other members of the crucible team, and behind them, watching from the gallery with wide and wondering eyes, representatives from dozens of species who had their own reasons to care about what happened today. Archon Velathon took his place at the central platform, and when he spoke, his voice was different from any time before. It was not commanding or cold or distant. It was heavy with something that sounded very much like shame. "This council has stood for 12,000 years, he began, and in that time it has brought peace to hundreds of worlds, facilitated trade between thousands of species, and built a galactic civilization that spans more star systems than any one mind can comprehend. These are achievements that I do not diminish, and that no one should forget." He paused, and the chamber was silent. But a civilization built even partly on a lie is a civilization standing on cracked ground. And today I must tell you that the ground beneath this council has been cracked from the very beginning. He gestured, and the Crucible's original design documents appeared on every display in the chamber. Schematics, kill probability calculations, population suppression protocols, all of it laid bare in the cold light of ancient data. The Crucible was a weapon, Velathon said, designed not to test, but to destroy. Every species that entered it and did not survive was not found unworthy by any fair measure. They were killed by a machine built to kill them, and afterward, their civilizations were suppressed, diminished, and in some cases, nearly erased from history. This council, this institution that we have all served and trusted, carries that blood on its foundations. The reactions rippled through the chamber. Grief from species who now understood what had been done to their ancestors, rage from others who felt betrayed, and a deep, uncomfortable silence from the elder species who had always benefited from the existing order. Several delegates from smaller species stood and spoke. They named ancestors who had been sent to the Crucible and never returned. Civilizations that had been crippled by quarantine measures that they now understood were punishments for daring to survive on dangerous worlds. Velathon let them speak, every one of them, and he did not look away. Then he turned to face the human delegation, and he did something that made the entire chamber gasp. Archon Velathon, leader of the Galactic Council, being of living crystal who had stood above every other species for centuries, bent his massive body forward in a bow so deep that his head nearly touched the platform. "Captain Marin," he said, "Ambassador Okafor, your species was sent into the Crucible to die. That was its purpose, and that was our expectation, spoken or unspoken. You were meant to disappear into that station and never come out, and the galaxy would have moved on as it always has, never knowing and never asking. Instead, you survived, not through brute force or blind luck, but through the very qualities that we told ourselves Deathworld species could never possess: cooperation, compassion, ingenuity, and an absolute refusal to abandon each other even when every rational calculation said you should. You were meant to prove that you were monsters. Instead, you proved that we were the monsters, and you did it without firing a single weapon." He straightened and faced the full assembly. "I ask this council to vote on the admission of humanity as a full member species, with all rights, privileges, and responsibilities that entails." The vote was called, and delegate after delegate registered their decision. Species that had argued against humanity for decades now voted in favor. Species that had been afraid now chose hope over fear. Species that had never cared one way or another about the small, loud creatures from the death world called Earth now looked at the 12 battered humans on the platform and saw something they recognized. The vote was unanimous. For the first time in the history of the Galactic Council, every single species voted the same way. Humanity was in. The chamber erupted in sound, applause, and song, and vibrations, and color shifts, and every other way that 1,000 different species express joy. And Ambassador Okafor closed his eyes for a moment, and let 30 years of struggle and patience and quiet determination wash through him. But Captain Marin was not finished. She stepped forward to the speaker's platform and raised her hand, and the chamber gradually settled into curiosity. "I am honored," she said, "and my species is honored. But I did not survive the crucible to simply take a seat and pretend that the past does not matter." She looked around the chamber, meeting as many eyes and sensors and optical organs as she could. The crucible was used against species who came before us, species who were just as worthy of life and respect as any being in this room. Some of them are still here, diminished and marginalized, living in the shadow of what was done to them. I am asking this council, as its newest member, to pass one additional resolution. She took a breath. The crucible must be permanently deactivated and its technology destroyed so that it can never be used again. And every species that was subjected to the crucible, every species that lost people to that machine, must receive formal recognition of what was done to them, a full public apology from this council, and meaningful reparations to help rebuild what was taken. The chamber was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Not the silence of shock, but the silence of something shifting, like tectonic plates moving deep beneath the surface of the world. Yueline was the first to stand in support, her wings glowing a brilliant gold. Then the Pelori delegation, then a dozen smaller species, then 50, then 100, and the motion passed with a majority so large that it was practically unanimous. In the gallery, representatives from species that had been living for centuries under the quiet weight of what the crucible had done to their ancestors began to weep. Some wept silently, and some wept with sounds that needed no translation. And the beings sitting beside them, some of whom had never given these diminished species a second thought, reached out and offered whatever comfort their bodies could give. Captain Marin watched this from the platform, and felt something tight in her chest finally begin to loosen. And then she did one more thing that nobody expected. She walked across the chamber floor, past delegates who parted to let her through, past aides and guards and observers, until she stood in front of Counselor Drethka. He had been stripped of his fleet command after the attempted attack on Earth's sector, and he stood alone in the gallery with no allies beside him. And he looked down at the human woman who was less than half his size, with an expression that mixed anger and confusion and something that might have been exhaustion. He clearly expected her to gloat, or threaten, or demand further punishment. It was what he would have done in her position, and it was what any Torvan would have done. Instead, Marin held out her hand, palm open, fingers extended. "On my world," she said, "this is how we greet someone we hope to work with. You were afraid, Counselor. I understand fear. I have lived with it my entire life. But we are here now, and the galaxy is different today than it was yesterday. And I would rather build something new with you than spend the next 100 years fighting over what came before." Drethka stared at her hand. This small, soft, 5-fingered hand, attached to a creature from a world that should have crushed her, boiled her, poisoned her, or eaten her 1,000 times over. This hand that had built traps, and held weapons, and pulled wounded teammates to safety, and refused to pull a lever that would have saved her own life at the cost of another. He looked at that hand for a very long time. Then, slowly, carefully, as if he were handling something fragile and precious, and completely foreign to everything he had ever known, the great Torvan warlord reached out with one of his 4 massive clawed hands, and took it. Around them, the chamber fell silent again, and then a sound began to build. Not applause exactly, but something like it. 1,000 species acknowledging in their own way that something important had just happened. Later, When the formalities were finished, and the resolutions were signed, and the galaxy had begun the long, difficult work of reckoning with its own history, Captain Marin stood alone at the great viewport of the Hall of 10,000 Stars. The stars stretched out before her in every direction. Billions of them, each one a sun, many of them warming worlds full of life and stories and possibilities that humanity was only just beginning to imagine. Ambassador Okafor found her there, standing in the starlight with her hands behind her back, and her reflection ghosting across the glass. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She smiled, and it was the kind of smile that comes from somewhere very deep, from a place that had been waiting a long time to feel this way. "I am thinking that the sky just got a lot bigger," she said. Okafor nodded and stood beside her, and the two of them looked out at the galaxy together in comfortable silence. And somewhere, deep in the deactivated bones of the Crucible Station, in circuits that had not fired in 800 years and would never fire again, the ancient AI recorded one final entry in a log that had been untouched for millennia. New category required. Species classification, Deathworld. Subcategory, Survivors. Addendum. Do not test again. Then the last light in the station went dark, and the Crucible was silent, forever.